The autumn wind swept through the grand corridors of Valdoria Castle, carrying with it whispers of change that would soon shake the very foundations of the kingdom. King Alexander stood at the towering windows of his private study, watching the golden leaves dance in the courtyard below. At 62, he had ruled Valdoria for nearly 3 decades, but tonight his weathered hands trembled as they gripped the windowsill. Behind him, Lady Isabella sat in stony silence, her emerald dress pooling around the ornate chair like spilled wine. She had been his companion for 15 years, standing by his side through scandals and celebrations alike. The people of Valdoria had grown to accept her presence, though many still whispered about her humble beginnings as a merchant's daughter who had caught the king's eye at a harvest festival. "You cannot be serious, Alexander." Isabella's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. Her dark eyes flashed with a mixture of disbelief and growing fury. "After everything we have endured together, you would cast me aside for her?" The king turned slowly, his blue eyes heavy with a sorrow that seemed to age him before her very eyes. His silver hair, once the pride of the kingdom, now appeared dull in the flickering candlelight. "Isabella, you must understand. The kingdom needs what?" she interrupted, rising from her chair with such force that it scraped against the marble floor. "A younger woman? A prettier face? Or perhaps someone with royal blood flowing through her veins?" Alexander's jaw tightened. Princess Elena had arrived at court just 3 months ago, sent as an ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. At 28, she possessed a grace and intelligence that commanded respect from nobles and commoners alike. Her auburn hair caught the light like flame, and her green eyes held depths that seemed to understand the burdens of leadership in ways that few could comprehend. "Elena understands the responsibilities of ruling," Alexander said quietly. "She has been trained since birth to replace me," Isabella finished, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She moved closer to him, her heels clicking against the floor like a countdown. "Do you think I am blind, Alexander? I have seen how you look at her during council meetings. I have watched you hang on her every word as if she speaks prophecies instead of simple diplomatic advice." The king closed his eyes, unable to deny the truth in her words. From the moment Princess Elena had entered his throne room, something had stirred within him that he had thought long dead. It was not merely her beauty, though she was undeniably stunning. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence with which she spoke of trade agreements and border disputes, the compassion in her voice when discussing the welfare of the people. "She makes me remember who I wanted to be when I first took the crown," Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I was young and believed I could change the world." Isabella's laugh was bitter and sharp. "And what am I, Alexander? What have I been all these years? A mistake? A convenience? Something to keep your bed warm until someone better came along?" "You know that is not true," he said. But even as the words left his lips, they felt hollow. Isabella had been many things to him over the years: companion, confidant, lover, but never the partner he truly needed. She had grown comfortable in her role, content to enjoy the luxuries of court life without truly understanding the weight of leadership. "Then prove it," Isabella demanded, stepping so close that he could smell her familiar perfume of roses and amber. "Send her away. Tell the Astorian court that her diplomatic mission is complete. Choose me, Alexander. Choose us." For a moment the king wavered. Isabella represented 15 years of his life, 15 years of shared memories and intimate moments. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that chilled him to his core, a desperation that bordered on obsession, a possessiveness that had grown like poison ivy around his heart. "I cannot," he said finally, his voice gaining strength. "The kingdom comes first, Isabella. It must always come first." Her face crumpled as if he had struck her. "The kingdom," she repeated hollowly. "Always the kingdom. Tell me, Alexander, when did you start confusing your personal desires with the needs of your people?" Before he could respond, a soft knock echoed through the chamber. Both turned toward the heavy oak doors as they opened to reveal Princess Elena herself. She wore a simple blue gown that somehow made her look more regal than Isabella's elaborate dress. Her auburn hair was pinned back in an elegant style, and her green eyes were alert and intelligent. "Your Majesty," Elena said, offering a graceful curtsy, "forgive the intrusion, but the council members are waiting for your decision regarding the grain shipments to the northern provinces." Alexander felt his heart skip as their eyes met. In that moment he saw his future stretching out before him, not just as a man but as a king who could rule with wisdom and compassion. Elena represented everything he had been searching for without knowing it. A true partner who could stand beside him as an equal, someone who understood that leadership meant sacrifice and service. "Of course," he said, his voice steadier than it had been all evening. "I will join them momentarily." Elena's gaze shifted briefly to Isabella, and in that look, both women understood that a line had been drawn. There was no malice in Elena's expression, only a quiet acknowledgement of the situation. She nodded once more and withdrew, leaving the king and his consort alone with the weight of unspoken words. Isabella stood frozen for a long moment, her world crumbling around her like autumn leaves in the wind. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that Alexander had to strain to hear her. "You have already made your choice, haven't you?" The king's silence was answer enough. The following morning arrived gray and heavy, as if the very sky mourned the events of the previous evening. King Alexander had not slept, instead spending the dark hours pacing his chambers and staring at official documents he could not bring himself to read. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical burden, making each breath feel labored and difficult. Lady Isabella had left the castle before dawn, taking only a small bag and her personal maid. The guards reported that she had ridden out through the eastern gate without a word, her horse's hooves echoing against the cobblestones like a funeral march. Alexander knew she would likely retreat to her family's estate in the countryside, but a part of him wondered if he would ever see her again. The throne room felt different that morning as the king took his place for the daily council meeting. The ornate chair that had always seemed like a symbol of power now felt like a cage, trapping him between duty and desire, between what his heart wanted and what his mind told him was right for the kingdom. Princess Elena entered with the other council members, her presence both a comfort and a source of anxiety for Alexander. She wore a deep green dress that complemented her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style that spoke of both practicality and refinement. As she took her place at the council table, she did not look directly at the king, but he could sense an awareness between them, an unspoken understanding that everything had changed. Lord Chancellor Marcus, a man whose loyalty to the crown had never wavered in 40 years of service, cleared his throat and opened the meeting. His gray beard was perfectly groomed as always, but his eyes held a concern that Alexander recognized. News traveled fast in the castle, and Isabella's sudden departure had not gone unnoticed. "Your Majesty," Marcus began carefully, "we must discuss the grain shipments to the northern provinces, as well as the trade agreement with the Kingdom of Meridia. The harvest season is nearly over, and our people need to know that food will be available through the winter months." Elena leaned forward slightly, her fingers gracefully arranged on the polished table surface. "If I may, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and confident, "I have reviewed the agricultural reports from both kingdoms. Astoria has experienced an exceptional harvest this year, and we would be willing to supplement any shortfalls in Valdoria's grain supplies." Alexander felt a surge of gratitude toward her, not just for the practical solution she offered, but for the way she seamlessly stepped into the role of advisor and partner. Unlike Isabella, who had always seemed more interested in the social aspects of court life, Elena understood the intricate details of governance and diplomacy. "That is most generous," the king replied, allowing himself to meet her eyes for the first time that morning. What terms would Astoria propose for such an arrangement? As Elena began to outline the details of the proposed trade agreement, Alexander found himself studying her more closely than ever before. She spoke with the authority of someone who had been raised to understand the complexities of international relations, yet there was warmth in her voice when she mentioned the welfare of the common people. She understood that politics was not just about power and wealth, but about the responsibility to care for those who depended on their leaders. Lord Chancellor Marcus watched this exchange with growing interest, his experienced eyes noting the subtle changes in his king's demeanor. Alexander was more engaged than he had been in months, asking thoughtful questions and offering insightful suggestions. The princess, for her part, responded to his ideas with enthusiasm and intelligence, building upon his thoughts rather than simply agreeing with them. "The northern provinces have been struggling since the early frost damaged their crops," Elena continued, spreading a detailed map across the table. If we establish a direct trade route through the mountain passes, we could cut delivery time in half and ensure that aid reaches the most remote villages before the heavy snows begin. Defense Minister Colonel Harrison, a gruff man who rarely spoke unless military matters were discussed, nodded approvingly. The princess speaks sense, Your Majesty. My scouts report that the mountain passes are still clear, but that window will not remain open much longer. Alexander studied the map, noting the careful annotations Elena had made in her neat handwriting. She had clearly spent considerable time researching not just the trade possibilities, but the actual geography and logistics involved. This was not the work of someone merely offering diplomatic pleasantries. This was the dedication of a true leader. Your homework is thorough, Princess, he said, and was rewarded with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. I believe we should proceed with your recommendations immediately. As the council meeting continued, Alexander found himself drawn into the most productive discussions he had experienced in years. Elena's presence seemed to energize the entire group, inspiring even the most reserved ministers to contribute ideas and suggestions. She had a gift for asking the right questions, for finding the connections between seemingly unrelated issues, and for keeping the conversation focused on practical solutions rather than abstract theories. When the formal meeting concluded, the other council members filed out of the throne room, leaving Alexander and Elena alone except for the ever-present guard stationed discreetly near the walls. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and carefully controlled emotions. Your Majesty, Elena said softly, rising from her chair, I hope you know that I never intended to cause any disruption to your personal life. If my presence here has created difficulties, I would understand if you wished to terminate my diplomatic mission early. Alexander stood as well, moving around the table until he was close enough to see the sincerity in her green eyes. She was giving him a way out, an opportunity to step back from the precipice he found himself approaching. But as he looked at her, he knew that sending her away would be the greatest mistake of his reign. Princess Elena, he said formally, though his voice carried undertones of deeper feeling, your diplomatic mission has been invaluable to both our kingdoms. I would consider it a great loss if you were to leave before we have fully explored all possibilities for cooperation between Valdoria and Astoria. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something in his expression. And on a personal level, Your Majesty, I would not want to be the cause of pain or conflict in your life. The king's composure finally cracked just slightly. The only pain would be in not following my heart, Princess. The conflict comes from trying to ignore what I know to be true. Elena's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the careful diplomatic mask she wore slipped away, revealing the woman beneath. And what is it that you know to be true? Alexander stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the subtle lavender scent she wore, close enough to see the way her lips parted slightly as she waited for his answer. That sometimes the greatest service we can provide to our kingdoms is to follow our hearts, even when the path is uncertain. Word spread through the kingdom like wildfire in a dry forest. Lady Isabella's sudden departure from court had been noted by every servant, noble and merchant within the castle walls, and by evening, the news had reached even the most remote villages of Valdoria. The common people, who had grown accustomed to seeing Isabella at the king's side during public ceremonies, began to whisper and speculate about what this change might mean for their future. Princess Elena found herself at the center of attention in ways she had never experienced before. As she walked through the castle corridors, conversations would stop abruptly, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. The castle staff, always polite but previously distant, now watched her every move with intense curiosity. Some looked at her with hope, others with suspicion, but none could ignore her presence. 3 days after Isabella's departure, Elena received an unexpected visitor in her quarters. Dame Margaret, the head of the castle's domestic staff and a woman who had served 3 generations of Valdorian royalty, knocked softly on her door as the evening shadows grew long. Princess Elena, Dame Margaret said as she entered, carrying a silver tea service. I hope you will forgive an old woman's presumption, but I thought you might appreciate some company this evening. Elena smiled warmly, gesturing for the older woman to sit. Dame Margaret had kind eyes and silver hair that was always perfectly arranged, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who understood the true workings of royal life. At 70, She had seen more political upheaval and romantic drama than most historians. "I am grateful for your company, Dame Margaret," Elena said, settling into the chair across from her visitor. "I confess that I feel somewhat isolated these days." Dame Margaret poured the tea with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite her age. "That is to be expected, Princess. Change is never easy, especially when it involves matters of the heart." Elena's cup paused halfway to her lips. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." The older woman's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "My dear, I have been in this castle since before King Alexander was born. I watched him grow from a headstrong boy into the man he is today. I have seen him make decisions based on duty, on logic, and on political necessity, but I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Heat rose in Elena's cheeks, but she did not deny Dame Margaret's observation. "His Majesty is a good man who cares deeply for his kingdom." "Indeed he is," Dame Margaret agreed, "but he is also a man who has carried the burden of leadership alone for far too long. Lady Isabella, may she find peace wherever she has gone, was never truly his equal. She was content to enjoy the privileges of her position without sharing the responsibilities." Elena set down her teacup, choosing her words carefully. "Dame Margaret, I hope you know that I never sought to create any conflict or difficulty. My mission here was purely diplomatic." "Of course it was, dear," the older woman said gently. "But sometimes fate has plans that go beyond our own intentions. Tell me, Princess, what do you see when you look at our king?" The question caught Elena off guard. She had been so focused on maintaining proper diplomatic protocols that she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge her own growing feelings. But as she sat in the quiet of her chambers, with only Dame Margaret's understanding eyes upon her, she found herself speaking from her heart. "I see a man who truly cares about his people," Elena said slowly. "I see someone who stays awake at night worrying about grain shipments and trade routes because he knows that families depend on his decisions. I see intelligence and compassion, and a loneliness that breaks my heart." Dame Margaret nodded approvingly. "And what does your heart tell you about your own feelings, Princess?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the depths of her tea as if it might hold answers. "My heart tells me that I am falling in love with a man I can never have," she whispered finally. "He is a king, Dame Margaret. I am a princess from another kingdom, sent here temporarily on a diplomatic mission. Even if his feelings mirror my own, what future could there possibly be for us?" "More of a future than you might think," Dame Margaret said mysteriously. "But that is a conversation for another time. Tonight I simply wanted you to know that you have allies in this castle, Princess, more than you realize." After Dame Margaret left, Elena stood at her window looking out over the castle grounds, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. The moon was full, casting silver light across the gardens where she and Alexander often walked during their evening discussions about trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. Those walks had become the highlight of her days, moments when the formal barriers between them seemed to dissolve and they could simply talk as two people who shared a deep concern for their responsibilities and their people. As if summoned by her thoughts, she saw a familiar figure walking alone through the moonlit garden below. King Alexander moved slowly among the roses, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Elena's heart clenched with sympathy and something deeper, a longing to comfort him, to share his burdens, to stand beside him not just as a diplomatic ally, but as a true partner. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Elena wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way down to the gardens. The night air was crisp with the promise of winter, and her breath formed small clouds as she approached the king. "Your Majesty," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. Alexander turned, and even in the moonlight, she could see the relief that crossed his features when he saw her. "Princess Elena, I was hoping you might join me." They walked together in comfortable silence for several minutes, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth of the garden paths. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday," he said, "about following one's heart despite uncertainty. I wonder if I am being selfish, Princess, if I am putting my own desires before the good of my kingdom." Elena stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the moonlight, with the scent of late-blooming roses surrounding them, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than the commanding presence he projected in the throne room. "Your Majesty," she said gently. "May I speak freely?" "Always," he replied immediately. "I have been in your court for 3 months now, and in that time I have watched you make decision after decision, based solely on what you believe is best for your people. You work longer hours than any of your ministers. You personally review every trade agreement and policy proposal, and you lose sleep worrying about citizens you have never met. If following your heart for once makes you selfish, then perhaps the kingdom needs a king who is occasionally selfish." Alexander's eyes widened slightly at her words. "You truly believe that?" "I believe," Elena said, stepping closer to him, "that a king who is happy and fulfilled will serve his people better than one who is duty-bound but empty inside. I believe that Valdoria deserves a ruler who remembers what it feels like to hope and dream and love." The king reached out slowly, as if asking permission, and gently touched her face. Elena leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "Elena," he whispered, using her name without title for the first time. "I think I am already lost." The next 2 weeks passed like a dream touched with golden light. King Alexander and Princess Elena continued their evening walks through the gardens, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each passing day. They spoke of childhood memories, of the books that had shaped their thinking, of their hopes for their respective kingdoms, and gradually, inevitably, of their growing feelings for each other. Alexander found himself counting the hours until these meetings, anticipating Elena's insights on matters of state, and cherishing the sound of her laughter when he shared stories from his youth. For her part, Elena discovered that beneath the king's formal exterior lay a man of remarkable warmth and humor, someone who could recite poetry from memory and who remembered the names of every servant in the castle. But their happiness existed in a fragile bubble that could not remain untouched by the realities of royal life. The first crack appeared on a crisp morning when Lord Chancellor Marcus requested a private audience with the king. His usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed a stack of official documents on Alexander's desk. "Your Majesty," Marcus began carefully, "I have received several communications that require your immediate attention. I fear they concern your relationship with Princess Elena." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he gestured for his old friend to continue. Marcus had served his father before him, and his loyalty was beyond question, even when his news was unwelcome. "First, we have received a formal inquiry from the court of Astoria," Marcus said, opening the top document. "King Ferdinand wishes to know the status of his daughter's diplomatic mission and when she might be expected to return home. He mentions that several suitable marriage proposals have been made for the princess, and he is eager to begin negotiations." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. Of course, Elena's father would be seeking advantageous marriages for her. She was 28 and a valuable political asset. The king had been so caught up in his own feelings that he had momentarily forgotten the practical realities that governed royal life. "What else?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. Marcus hesitated before opening the second document. "We have also received communications from several of our own nobles expressing concern about Lady Isabella's departure and the rumors surrounding your relationship with the Astorian princess. Duke Edmund and Count Richard have requested a formal meeting to discuss what they call matters of succession and stability." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. Duke Edmund was Isabella's cousin, a man who had never missed an opportunity to advance his family's interests. Count Richard, meanwhile, had always harbored ambitions for greater political influence and would likely see this situation as an opportunity to insert himself into royal affairs. "And the third document?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded hearing more bad news. "A letter from Lady Isabella herself," Marcus said quietly. "She writes from her family's estate, requesting permission to address the court formally about her 15 years of service to the crown. She claims to have important information about Princess Elena that the kingdom should know." Alexander felt his blood run cold. Isabella was proud and wounded, and in that combination lay great danger. He knew she was capable of creating significant trouble if she felt cornered or betrayed. "What does she claim to know about Elena?" he asked. "She does not specify in the letter, Your Majesty, but she has requested that you grant her an audience within the week, before what she calls irreversible decisions are made." The king stood and walked to his window, looking out over the gardens where he and Elena had shared so many precious moments. The autumn sunlight seemed harsh now, revealing the stark reality of their situation. How had he been so foolish as to believe that love could conquer the complex politics of royal life? "Your Majesty," Marcus said gently, "if I may offer some counsel? Princess Elena is a remarkable woman, and she has brought a vitality to your leadership that has been absent for years. But you must consider the political implications of any decisions you make. The stability of the kingdom depends upon it." Before Alexander could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Elena herself appeared in the doorway, her green dress bright against the dark wood paneling, her face glowing with the happiness that had become her constant companion in recent weeks. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she said, offering a graceful curtsy. "I did not realize you were in a private meeting. I can return later." "No," Alexander said quickly, then paused, realizing how his eagerness might sound to Marcus. "That is, if Lord Chancellor Marcus has finished his report, perhaps you could join us. These matters may concern you as well." Elena entered the room, but Alexander could see that she sensed the tension immediately. Her diplomat's training had taught her to read the subtle signs of political stress, and both men's faces clearly showed that serious matters were being discussed. Marcus, ever the professional, briefly outlined the 3 communications they had received. As he spoke, Alexander watched Elena's face closely, seeing her process each piece of information with the analytical mind that had impressed him from their first meeting. When Marcus finished, Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sadness. "Your Majesty," she said formally, "it appears that my presence here has become a source of political difficulty for you and your kingdom. Perhaps it would be best if I informed my father that my diplomatic mission has been completed successfully and requested permission to return to Astoria immediately." "No," Alexander said, the word coming out more forcefully than he had intended. Both Elena and Marcus looked at him in surprise. The king took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would set their course for whatever was to come. "Princess Elena, your diplomatic mission has indeed been successful, but it is far from complete. The trade agreements we have discussed will take months to finalize properly, and your expertise is essential to ensuring their success. As for the other matters," he turned to Marcus, "schedule meetings with Duke Edmund and Count Richard for tomorrow afternoon. I will address their concerns directly and honestly." "And Lady Isabella's request for an audience?" Marcus asked. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his mind working through the possible consequences of various choices. Finally, he nodded grimly. "Grant her request. Schedule the audience for 3 days hence in the formal throne room with the full council present. If Isabella wishes to make accusations or revelations, she will do so publicly and officially, where they can be properly addressed and evaluated." Elena stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Your Majesty, if Lady Isabella has concerns about my character or my mission here, perhaps it would be better if I were not present. I would not want my presence to inflame an already difficult situation." Alexander turned to her, and in his eyes, Elena saw a determination she had never witnessed before. When he spoke, his voice carried all the authority of his crown, but also something deeper, the conviction of a man who had finally chosen to fight for what he believed in. "Princess Elena," he said formally, "you will not only be present for Lady Isabella's audience, you will sit at my right hand as my honored guest and trusted advisor. Whatever accusations she wishes to make, she will make them to both of us together." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus looked troubled but resigned. Elena appeared moved but uncertain, and Alexander stood tall with the bearing of a king who had finally decided to follow his heart, regardless of the political cost. The meeting with Duke Edmund and Count Richard took place in the castle's smaller council chamber, a room lined with portraits of Alexander's ancestors and heavy tapestries that seemed to absorb sound and light. The king had chosen this setting deliberately, intimate enough for honest conversation, but formal enough to remind his visitors of the respect due to their sovereign. Duke Edmund arrived first, his tall frame imposing in a dark blue velvet coat adorned with the silver threads that marked his noble rank. At 55, he possessed the calculating eyes of a man who had spent decades maneuvering through court politics, and his resemblance to his cousin Isabella was unmistakable in the sharp angles of his face and the proud set of his shoulders. Count Richard followed shortly after, younger at 42 but no less ambitious. His auburn beard was perfectly groomed and his green eyes held an intensity that Alexander had always found slightly unsettling. Unlike Edmund, who came from old nobility, Richard had earned his title through military service and strategic marriages, making him both more aggressive and more desperate to maintain his position. "Your Majesty?" Duke Edmund began after the formal greetings had been exchanged. "We come to you today as loyal subjects concerned about the stability and future of our beloved kingdom." Alexander remained seated in his chair, projecting calm authority despite the tension he felt building in his chest. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen. Please speak freely about whatever troubles you." Count Richard leaned forward eagerly, clearly having rehearsed his words. "Your Majesty, the sudden departure of Lady Isabella has created uncertainty throughout the kingdom. The people have grown accustomed to seeing her at your side, and her absence raises questions about succession, about the future of the royal line. Furthermore," Duke Edmund added smoothly, "the growing closeness between your Majesty and the foreign princess has become a subject of much speculation. While Princess Elena is undoubtedly a charming and capable woman, we must consider the political implications of any personal relationship that might develop." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "What political implications concern you most, Duke Edmund?" "Your Majesty, if you were to form a romantic attachment to Princess Elena, it could be seen as favoritism toward Astoria in our trade negotiations. Other kingdoms might view any agreements as the result of personal influence rather than fair diplomatic process. This could damage Valdoria's reputation and complicate future international relationships." Count Richard nodded vigorously. "And domestically, Your Majesty, there are questions about what this means for the stability of the throne. Lady Isabella may not have been your queen, but she provided a sense of continuity that the people found reassuring. If you were to suddenly attach yourself to a foreign princess, especially one significantly younger than yourself, it might appear impulsive." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander felt his temper rising, but forced himself to remain calm. These men were testing him, probing for weakness, trying to determine how far they could push their agenda. "Gentlemen," Alexander said quietly, "I appreciate your concerns, but I must remind you that matters of my personal life are ultimately my decision to make. The crown has responsibilities to the kingdom, yes, but it also has the right to pursue happiness and fulfillment." Duke Edmund's expression hardened slightly. "Of course, Your Majesty. However, we have also heard disturbing rumors about the circumstances of Princess Elena's arrival here. My cousin Isabella has mentioned that there may be more to the princess's diplomatic mission than appears on the surface." "What exactly is Lady Isabella claiming?" Alexander asked, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "She has not shared the details with us," Count Richard said quickly, "but she has requested the opportunity to present evidence to the court that she believes will illuminate Princess Elena's true motivations for remaining in Valdoria so long." Alexander stood slowly, using his height and the weight of his crown to project authority. "Let me be perfectly clear, gentlemen. Princess Elena is an honored guest in this kingdom, and she has conducted herself with nothing but dignity and professionalism since her arrival. Any accusations against her character will be thoroughly investigated, but they will also be met with the full protection that my court extends to all diplomatic visitors." Both nobles shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they had perhaps pushed too far. Duke Edmund attempted to salvage the situation. "Your Majesty, we mean no disrespect to Princess Elena. We simply believe that all information should be made available before any significant decisions are made regarding your personal future." "My personal future," Alexander repeated slowly, "will be determined by my own judgment, informed by my counsel but not dictated by it. Is there anything else you wish to discuss?" The dismissal was clear and both men stood to leave. But as they reached the door, Count Richard turned back with one final attempt at influence. "Your Majesty, we hope you will remember that the nobles of this kingdom have always been your strongest supporters. We ask only that you consider how your decisions might affect the delicate balance of power that has kept Valdoria stable for generations." After they left, Alexander remained standing in the council chamber, his hands clenched behind his back as he stared at the portrait of his father. The late king had ruled for 40 years without ever facing such personal scrutiny. having married his queen in a purely political arrangement that everyone understood and accepted. Alexander had always envied his father's apparent certainty, but now he wondered if that certainty had come at the cost of personal happiness. A soft knock interrupted his brooding thoughts. Princess Elena entered quietly, her face showing concern for his obvious distress. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "Dame Margaret told me about your meeting. I hope it went well." Alexander turned to her, and the sight of her genuine concern for his welfare almost broke his composure. In a world full of people who wanted something from him, power, influence, advantage, Elena simply wanted his happiness. "It was enlightening," he said carefully. "Elena, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty." Her green eyes grew serious. "Of course. Is there anything about your mission here, anything about your reasons for staying so long that I should know? Anything that could be used against you or against us?" Elena's face showed a moment of confusion, followed by understanding. "You mean Lady Isabella's claims that she has damaging information about me?" "Yes." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander felt his heart begin to race with worry. Then she looked up at him with clear, honest eyes. "Your Majesty, the only secret I have been keeping is the truth about my feelings for you. When I arrived here, my mission was indeed purely diplomatic. But as the weeks passed, as I got to know you and saw the kind of man and king you are, I found myself hoping for reasons to extend my stay. I have written to my father several times, each time finding new diplomatic justifications for remaining in Valdoria longer." Alexander felt a mixture of relief and tenderness wash over him. "So you have been as reluctant to leave as I have been to let you go?" "More reluctant than I should be," Elena admitted. "I know that my feelings complicate everything, Alexander. If my presence here is damaging your kingdom or your position, I will leave immediately, regardless of what it costs me personally." The king stepped closer to her, taking her hands in his. "Elena, whatever Lady Isabella claims to know, whatever political pressure our nobles apply, I want you to know that I believe in you completely, and I believe in us, even if it costs you politically." Alexander was quiet for a moment, weighing his words carefully. "I have spent my entire reign making decisions based on what others expected of me, what tradition demanded, what political necessity required. For once in my life, I want to make a choice based on what I know to be right in my heart." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "Then we will face whatever comes next together." "Together," Alexander confirmed, lifting her hands to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "No matter what Isabella believes she knows, no matter what accusations she makes, we will face them as partners." Outside the council chamber windows, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising a tempest that would test every decision they had made and every feeling they had discovered. But in that moment, holding Elena's hands and seeing the trust in her eyes, Alexander felt stronger than he had in years. The day of Lady Isabella's formal audience dawned cold and gray, with frost covering the castle grounds like a crystalline warning of the winter to come. The throne room had been prepared according to ancient protocol, with representatives from every major noble house in attendance, along with foreign ambassadors and high-ranking members of the court. The great hall buzzed with nervous energy as courtiers speculated about what revelations might emerge from this unprecedented confrontation. King Alexander sat upon his throne with regal composure, but those who knew him well could see the tension in the set of his shoulders and the careful stillness of his hands. He wore his most formal robes of state, deep blue velvet embroidered with the golden lion of Valdoria, and the crown rested upon his silver hair like the weight of history itself. True to his word, Princess Elena sat in the chair of honor at his right hand, a position traditionally reserved for visiting royalty or the most trusted advisors. She wore a gown of midnight blue that complemented the king's attire, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant style that spoke of both dignity and defiance. Despite the gravity of the situation, she maintained the serene composure that had first impressed Alexander months ago. Lord Chancellor Marcus stood beside the throne, his weathered face grave, as he prepared to oversee what could potentially become the most significant court proceeding of Alexander's reign. The formal protocols were clear, but the emotional and political stakes were unlike anything the kingdom had experienced in generations. The great doors of the throne room opened with ceremonial precision, and Lady Isabella entered with all the drama she had undoubtedly rehearsed. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk that made her dark hair appear almost black in contrast, and diamonds glittered at her throat, a reminder of the 15 years she had spent as the king's companion. Her entrance was perfectly calculated to evoke both sympathy and admiration, the image of a wronged woman maintaining her dignity despite her pain. Behind Isabella walked Duke Edmund and Count Richard, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with anticipation. Several other nobles followed, creating an impressive procession that seemed designed to emphasize the political weight behind Isabella's claims. Isabella approached the throne with measured steps, her head held high until she reached the appropriate distance for a formal court appearance. Then she sank into a deep curtsy, holding the position for exactly the prescribed time before rising to face the king she had loved and lost. "Your Majesty," Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast throne room, "I appear before you today not as a spurned woman seeking revenge, but as a loyal subject of Valdoria who feels compelled to share information that may affect the security and future of our beloved kingdom." Alexander's voice was steady and formal as he replied, "Lady Isabella, you have requested this audience and it has been granted. The court will hear whatever you wish to present, and your words will be given the consideration due to your years of service to the crown." Isabella inclined her head gracefully, then turned her gaze toward Princess Elena. When she spoke again, her words were clearly intended for everyone present, but her eyes remained fixed on her rival. "Your Majesty, members of the court, I come before you today to reveal that Princess Elena of Astoria has not been entirely honest about her reasons for remaining in Valdoria, nor about certain aspects of her past that may make her unsuitable as a close advisor to our king." A ripple of whispered conversation swept through the assembled courtiers before Marcus called for silence. Elena remained perfectly still, but Alexander could see the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated her growing tension. "Please present your evidence." "Lady Isabella," Alexander said formally, though every word felt like glass in his throat. Isabella reached into a small silk purse and withdrew several documents, holding them up for all to see. "I have here correspondence between Princess Elena and certain members of the Astorian court that reveals her true mission in Valdoria was not merely diplomatic trade. Negotiations." The throne room fell completely, silent as everyone strained to hear what would come next. Isabella's voice grew stronger, more confident as she sensed the attention of her audience. "These letters, obtained through sources I will not name to protect their safety, show that Princess Elena was specifically instructed by her father, King Ferdinand, to use her considerable charms to influence your Majesty's decision-making processes. The goal was not fair trade agreements, but preferential treatment for Astoria that would disadvantage Valdoria's other trading partners." Alexander felt his blood begin to boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You accuse Princess Elena of deliberate deception and manipulation?" "I do, Your Majesty. Furthermore," Isabella continued, her voice rising with dramatic emphasis, "I have evidence that suggests Princess Elena has been reporting the details of your private conversations back to the Astorian court, including sensitive information about Valdoria's military defenses and economic vulnerabilities." The accusation hit the throne room like a thunderbolt. Several nobles gasped audibly, and Alexander could see shock and suspicion beginning to spread across faces throughout the great hall. The charge of espionage was far more serious than simple romantic manipulation. It touched on matters of national security and royal betrayal. Princess Elena finally spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the gravity of the accusations against her. "Your Majesty, I categorically deny these charges. While I have indeed corresponded with my father about diplomatic matters, as is proper for any ambassador, I have never shared sensitive information about Valdoria's defenses or vulnerabilities, nor have I been instructed to use personal influence for political gain." Isabella smiled coldly. "Of course you would deny it, Princess. But documents do not lie, and I have witnesses who can verify the authenticity of these letters." Alexander stood slowly from his throne, and the assembled court fell completely silent. When he spoke, his voice carried the full authority of his crown and 30 years of leadership. "Lady Isabella, these are extremely serious accusations you have made against an honored guest of this kingdom, and a representative of a friendly nation. Before this court proceeds further, I demand to examine these alleged documents personally, along with any witnesses you claim to possess. Of course, Your Majesty, Isabella replied smoothly, moving forward to present the papers. I believe you will find them quite illuminating. Alexander took the documents, but instead of examining them immediately, he looked directly at Elena. In her green eyes he saw not guilt or fear, but something that looked remarkably like disappointment, not in the accusations, but in the fact that he might believe them even for a moment. Princess Elena, Alexander said formally, you have heard the charges against you. How do you answer? Elena rose from her chair with fluid grace, her bearing proud and unashamed. When she spoke, her words were directed not just to Alexander, but to the entire court. Your Majesty, members of the court, I stand before you today with a clear conscience and an honest heart. I have served as Princess of Astoria and as a diplomatic representative with honor and integrity. While I cannot speak to the authenticity of documents I have not yet seen, I can say with absolute certainty that I have never betrayed the trust that King Alexander has placed in me, nor have I ever acted against the interests of Valdoria. She paused, looking directly at Alexander with an expression of such sincere trust that it took his breath away. Your Majesty, I place my reputation, my honor, and my future entirely in your hands. If you believe these accusations have merit, I will accept whatever judgment you deem appropriate. But I ask only that you examine the evidence with the same wisdom and fairness that you bring to all matters of justice in your kingdom. Alexander looked down at the papers in his hands, then back at Elena's face, then at Isabella's expression of barely contained triumph. In that moment, the choice before him was clear, not just about the truth of the accusations, but about what kind of king he wanted to be, and what kind of future he wanted to build for his kingdom. The entire court held its breath as King Alexander made the decision that would define the rest of his reign. King Alexander held the documents in his hands for what seemed like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down upon him like the very foundations of his kingdom. The throne room remained absolutely silent, every person present understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in Valdorian history. The king's decision would not only determine the fate of Princess Elena, but would reveal the character of his leadership and the direction of his reign. Finally, Alexander looked up from the papers, his blue eyes moving slowly across the assembled court before settling on Lady Isabella's expectant face. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. Lady Isabella, he began, these documents that you have presented are indeed illuminating, but perhaps not in the way you intended. Isabella's confident expression faltered slightly, uncertainty creeping into her dark eyes. Alexander continued, holding up the papers for all to see. Upon examination, I find that these letters bear several irregularities that call their authenticity into serious question. The paper is of a type not commonly used by the Astorian court. The ink appears fresh despite allegedly being written weeks ago, and most tellingly, the handwriting, while skillfully imitated, lacks certain characteristics unique to Princess Elena's natural script. A gasp swept through the throne room as the implications of the king's words became clear. Isabella's face went pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. Your Majesty, I assure you that these documents were obtained through reliable sources. Furthermore, Alexander interrupted, his voice growing stronger, I have taken the liberty of having my own intelligence sources verify the claims made in these alleged letters. Not one of the sensitive details supposedly shared with Astoria can be found in any Astorian documents or communications. In fact, King Ferdinand himself has sent word that he has received no such intelligence from his daughter. The king stood from his throne, the full majesty of his position evident as he addressed the court with unwavering authority. It appears, Lady Isabella, that in your pain and anger, you have chosen to present fabricated evidence to this court in an attempt to damage the reputation of an innocent woman and manipulate the crown's decision-making. This is not only an act of dishonor against Princess Elena, but an act of treason against the throne itself. Isabella's composure finally cracked completely. Alexander, you cannot be serious. After 15 years together, you would choose her over me based on documents that could easily have been altered by anyone. You are blinded by infatuation with a woman half your age. Silence. Alexander's voice thundered through the throne room, and Isabella stepped back as if physically struck. "You will address your king with proper respect, or you will be removed from this court immediately." Duke Edmund stepped forward desperately, trying to salvage the situation. "Your Majesty, surely we can resolve this matter privately, without such public declarations." "No, Duke Edmund," Alexander said firmly. "Lady Isabella chose to make these accusations publicly, and they will be addressed publicly. The honor of Princess Elena and the integrity of this court demand nothing less." The king turned his attention to Elena, who had remained standing throughout the confrontation, her face pale but her bearing dignified. When their eyes met, Alexander felt the same surge of certainty that had guided his best decisions as a ruler. "Princess Elena," he said formally, "on behalf of the Kingdom of Valdoria and my personal honor as king, I offer you a public apology for the baseless accusations that have been made against you in this court. Your integrity and character have been impugned without cause, and I deeply regret any distress this has caused you." Elena inclined her head gracefully. "Your Majesty's faith in my honor means more to me than I can express." Alexander looked out over the assembled court, seeing a mixture of shock, approval, and in some cases, calculation as various nobles reassessed their political positions in light of this dramatic turn of events. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom," Alexander declared, "that Princess Elena of Astoria has served as a diplomatic representative with distinction and honor. Her contributions to the trade agreements between our kingdoms have been invaluable, and her counsel has proven both wise and beneficial to Valdoria's interests." He paused, knowing that his next words would set the course for his personal future, as well as his kingdom's political direction. "Furthermore," Alexander continued, his voice carrying a note of warmth that had been absent from the formal proceedings, "I hereby extend an invitation to Princess Elena to remain in Valdoria as a permanent advisor to the crown, with all the honors and protections that such a position entails." The implications of this offer were not lost on anyone present. A permanent advisory position would allow Elena to remain in the kingdom indefinitely, providing the foundation for whatever personal relationship might develop between her and the king. Elena's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and relief. "Your Majesty, I am deeply honored by your offer and accept with humble gratitude." Alexander nodded, then turned his attention back to Isabella, his expression growing cold and implacable. "Lady Isabella, you have chosen to repay 15 years of royal favor with deception and false accusations. While I will not forget the years of companionship we shared, I cannot overlook this betrayal of trust. You are hereby banished from court for a period of 1 year, during which time you will reflect upon the consequences of allowing wounded pride to overcome honor and loyalty." Isabella's face crumpled, but she managed to maintain enough composure for one final attempt at salvaging her position. "Alexander, please. I acted out of love for you, out of fear that you were being deceived. Surely you can understand." "What I understand," Alexander said quietly, "is that love should inspire trust and generosity, not suspicion and cruelty. True love wishes for the happiness of the beloved, even when that happiness comes from another source." The king's words carried a finality that left no room for further argument. Isabella stood frozen for a moment, then sank into a deep, formal curtsy that somehow managed to convey both submission and bitter defeat. "As you wish, Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she turned and walked from the throne room with as much dignity as she could muster, followed by Duke Edmund and several other nobles who had clearly chosen the wrong side of this particular conflict. As the great doors closed behind the departing group, the tension in the throne room began to dissipate. Alexander looked out over the remaining courtiers, seeing new respect in many faces and understanding that his handling of this crisis had actually strengthened rather than weakened his position as king. "Lord Chancellor Marcus," Alexander said, "please prepare the necessary documents to formalize Princess Elena's new advisory position. I believe we have much work to do in the coming months to strengthen the bonds between our kingdoms." "Of course, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, his voice carrying approval and perhaps even a hint of relief. As the formal court session concluded and the assembled nobles began to file out of the throne room, Alexander and Elena found themselves alone, except for the discreet presence of the royal guards. For the first time in days, the king allowed his formal composure to relax slightly. "Elena," he said softly, using her name without title. "I hope you know that I never doubted your honesty for even a moment." She smiled, the warmth returning to her green eyes. "I knew that you would see through Isabella's deception, Alexander. Your judgment has never failed your kingdom, and I trusted that it would not fail us." Alexander stepped closer to her, close enough to take her hands in his. "And now? What comes next for us?" Elena's smile widened, and in it Alexander saw the promise of a future filled with partnership, understanding, and love. "Now," she said, "we build something new together, a partnership that will serve both our kingdoms and our hearts." As evening fell over Valdoria Castle, King Alexander and Princess Elena walked together through the gardens where their love had first bloomed. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, but their future stretched ahead bright with possibility. The political storms had passed, their love had been tested and proven true, and the kingdom had witnessed the kind of leadership that chose truth and honor over convenience and tradition. In the distance, the lights of the village twinkled like stars, and both the king and princess knew that their story was not ending, but truly beginning.